This is my message to the people of France, those who are living in France or those who are overseas, who are obviously French citizens. I hope you know that yesterday's election was an opportunity to turn the tide against autocratic governments or authoritarianism that is actually becoming a trending and is actually becoming a new norm from across the world, from every government that is actually chanting for populist movement and nationalism that obviously has been happening over the past few years. From what I saw from the previous election, even the previous years from around the world, we see a lot of common things what we saw when obviously the election comes around, and that is that they will obviously ultimately predict, not only predict, but also an outcome of how the countries will function in the government throughout the next several years. For me, I would say there has been a lot of too many close to call votes, which in this case it actually happened in France. That also happened recently in South Korea's presidential election as well, with the close tie votes there happened in the last month. We also seen in Canada with last year's election that ultimately also got into too close to call vote. Germany's election also went to too close to call vote. Even in the United States here, where I obviously living, has also been too close to call vote. And obviously, I would tell you, even if it's too close to call vote or a narrow, slim margin that the votes were counted, and at the same time it was too close to call to the point that it ultimately does not decide who's going to be the next leader of your country, I will tell you that's going to be a continuing trend. And that trend will never obviously going to be stopped or halted at this moment because obviously because of a populist rhetoric or nationalist movement has been carried on to the point that actually created a setback for a lot of progress that we made for humanities for over several decades and many centuries for many years. I'm telling you in a historical perspective, even the current history has not been written yet. I would tell you that I've been watching the news every single day to try to figure out what are the current trends and to see what's going to happen in the next several months in order to make sure that not only we prepare ourselves, not only as an individually, but also the world itself is obviously potentially is going to suffer a lot of collapse, not only on humanity, but also the respect and dignity that we obviously have been created for many, many centuries and years since obviously what we got through. And now obviously I think a lot of people actually forgotten about the basic respect. And I would say for me, in my part, I think it's time to actually let the people know that what we saw in the French presidential election, last night's election would have been obviously turned into a different outcome. And that outcome, excuse me, something got in my eye. That outcome would have obviously been a different outcome. And we don't know what that outcome would have been. In my thought, the outcome would have been two parts. One, it would have been gone into Macron's election, where obviously he could have won, and obviously that could be a sign of relief where obviously democracy still withstand and held steadfast to the point that it will potentially become a beacon of sign of hope for that the democracy will continue and flourish and obviously will bring humanity to the light itself. But unfortunately, because of yesterday's election, is that obviously it's not the end of sight that democracy will continue to hold. And I'm not saying for a pessimistic view on this, but I would say it's the beginning that we have to continue to fight for democracy. And obviously, I think that's one of the things that obviously we keep forgetting about is that we take these for granted, like the freedom of elections, the freedom of speech, the freedom of rights, the freedom of assembly, all the things that we obviously learned, the basic civic and the civil respect of the humanity is that we totally keep forgetting about these things in our entire life to make sure that obviously we obviously not only stabilize, not only as a country, but also society and the people and the culture itself. But unfortunately, throughout the pandemic for the last 2 years, unfortunately, that's not the case. As well, obviously, we're starting to see a lot of division among ethnic tribes within among its own people and not willing to care and respect and treat with dignity and respect to each other. And I think that's one of the things that I do have saw and is not keep improving itself. And I think that's gotta have to change somehow. Because yesterday, so not only the yesterday election actually proved to the people of France and the French citizen itself that they're willing to defend and fight against the autocratic governments, and that totally has demonstrated that the willingness of courage, the willingness to drive the change through obviously through movements and the will of the people and the spirit of the people and the humanity itself is still alive to the people of France. And I know the history, a brief history about France, the revolution they have gone through and the overcoming that resilience and the spirit of the humanity of people, it is still truly alive as today. And I'll tell you that not only is because I know about the history of the world, but I think the current history is already tend to repeat itself. Not only just because the people have forgotten a lot of respect and the dignity, but also they're not willing to care for each other and willing to respect each other regardless of their race, their gender, their national identity, or their national ethnic groups. And I'm thinking obviously when we obviously see in politics, especially with Le Pen, where obviously she says she obviously does not encourage people to obviously wear their own religious uniforms in public, obviously because it is seen as a threat. Unfortunately, that's completely the opposite way of saying that you don't obviously give freedom of the rights or freedom of religion to other people who look indifferent from you. And I'm thinking that's the same rhetoric that we see a lot of people around the world, especially with the election, the governance, and the will of the people. The democratic process already gone into hold right now. And I'm thinking that the whole entire world actually are looking for other alternative strategy to bring an autocratic government where the strongman politics, the masculinity, and the obviously trying to make sure that they trying to break the old cultural tradition that we saw over the democratic processes that have been given to them, especially the rule of law diminishing itself, deteriorating the human rights, as well as the mistreatment among its foreigners and the refugees, like what we saw in the conflict region zone in Yemen and in other parts of the countries, including Russia's Ukraine crisis. And I'm telling you that the people of Ukraine are obviously in a dire, desperate situation. And I'm pretty sure that when I was following these news, that definitely I know that basically that comfort zone was not, obviously, it's not going to be important to me. It's not. Because when I think in their shoes, I'm pretty sure they'll be living in a difficult situation. They are. When they obviously go to other countries to not only explore other countries, but their new home as well, to seek for shelter, to bring a new life, to settle a new life. And I'm thinking that that's not an easy task for anyone, especially including myself, if I went to a different country and started to adjust to a new life, to a new social norm, the culture and the political governance, how it's settled there. And I'm thinking a lot of people tend to forget about these things because when we obviously travel or tourist in areas where obviously it's well known, we tend to forget why freedom exists, or the reason why we obviously could travel any parts of the world depending on your country's legal governance and the travel visas. Fortunately, in the United States, obviously you could travel anywhere around the world except the regions where obviously they banned because of sanctions rules. But I'll tell you, the reality is that I think we keep forgetting about these things to the point that why we take freedom for granted. but I have never in my entire life have taken freedom for granted at all, whether it's the election, whether it's through travel, whether it's through buying a car. Other countries don't have that obligation or luxury. And even though we're in a difficult economic situation right now, and I'm thinking that that's the situation that I think we need to keep reflecting and deep thinking about what are the things that we could do to try to not all uphold the democratic principles, but also the willingness to drive the change and to reform the democratic process. And that does not mean what we saw in the January the 6th. That is not a democratic process. What it should have been is willing to follow the rule of law and to make sure that we respect dignity regardless of differences. And that not only just upholding the freedom, but also the democratic process as well. And here's the thing that what gets me upset a lot is that I think people still take it for freedom for granted, but also don't even care about it. And this brings me up to question whether or not if you care if your country is falling under a dictatorship or autocratic governments, because once your country falls under an autocratic government, what it will happen is that they will obviously denounce the Constitution. They will basically strip the constitutional powers itself, not only obviously abolishing it, but completely they're obviously deteriorating the rule of law. And if you don't have the rule of law, it's basically a game over situation where basically either a military style government or obviously a person who has a dictator influence or behaviors and the attitudes could take over the power. And that has been a central theme throughout the many years prior, not only the French presidential election, but also US presidential elections since 2016. And I'm not going to name the candidates who I'm referring to because you know what I'm talking about. And I'm thinking that that's some of the things that obviously I think the French people, especially with the yesterday's election last night, have brought me hope that not only actually they gone through a lot of perseverance, the resilience, they overcome the challenges, they overcame that, especially what they saw in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I totally remember there has been a lot of massacre over there. This is totally an example of a historical repetition we saw in the Holocaust during World War II era. And cannot believe that this just happened in the 21st century where a Holocaust still continues. To this day, that's to the point that people around the world, they take into consideration, but they obviously don't have a lot of grievances or empathetic because it's not their own national identity. But that does not mean you should not care for it. I do care regardless of whatever the regions you are from or around the world and the cultures that you share, because I respect that regardless of any differences. But unfortunately, a lot of people around the world don't show that. And even though that's not a lot of people, there are still few among others who actually do respect the cultural differences or political differences, and they still become friends. And unfortunately, that's what is missing right now, is that we don't have a collaboration or willingness to obviously cooperate with other international leaders, or whether it's your international friends from overseas. And I think without that cooperation or collaboration from that idea, is that obviously we're starting to move into a much more plunging into a darkness where obviously democracy will start to take away from itself. And if we don't uphold and defend the freedoms of the democratic ideals that not only the American founding fathers have been founded to prevent from tyranny, but also to make sure that we uphold those traditions and our values that have been upheld for many years. Then unfortunately, if we don't uphold that, then potentially the autocratic government will become your lifestyle to the point that it will ultimately also become a totalitarianism if things are not checked. And in the democracy, it's not all perfect, and we don't know that. It's not tend to be perfect. And I know obviously there are sometimes we could get pessimistic about it, that things are not working, obviously. Obviously they're democratic governments have failed upon us. They're not willing to listen to us. The international institution like the UN are obviously not willing to obviously to reform or also trying to give up the veto powers to major power states. And I'm thinking that that's the things that we tend to obviously give an excuse to say we're not willing to obviously look for democracy or look into the UN to say obviously they're going to save or claim for humanity or obviously trying to save the will of the people. Because we tend to forget what we saw in World War II. We tend to forget what our grandparents' generation had gone through. It's exactly the same thing what we're going through right now. Except it's not economic depression that we experience that worse, but it's getting to a lot of impact. What we saw in inflation, where we saw a lot of prices going up to the point that it actually impacts not only the shelter, but also the food and the basic clothing. Everything is going up to the point that it's becoming unsustainable for people. And unfortunately, that is becoming a problematic that I think a lot of corporations are out there are driving up the prices because they're willing to do so. It's okay to do so. But unfortunately, they're not willing to obviously drive up the wages to make sure that they have the providable living, but also the affordable living as well, to provide for them to be sustainable. All of these issues ties back to the point that the will of the people and the spirit of the people and the courage to fight against the wrongdoings and the moral values that they uphold are still obviously true and it still exists as of today. It's just that we don't see a lot of those representation in the media. But I am up for it, that I obviously uphold the moral values, the democratic principles, and the governance and the freedom that I don't take for granted. Whether it's running for election or voting in public office or basically freedom of assembly, association, the free speech line, what I'm doing here, they're obviously sending a message to the people of France, telling them that obviously I have not given up on my activism, not only in political, but also several other different issues as well within the SDGs that I truly, deeply care about, that I'm willing to fight for. And unfortunately, it looks like I'm the only one in here who are actually willing to continue to fight, which is true. But I think a lot of people out there who are obviously just not willing to listen to their, not only their governmental leaders, but they're not willing to listen to other people who are obviously who are on the other side of the aisle because of their differences, because of their culture, their social, their economic. They're willing to obviously have a competition. They're willing to fight against each other. That's the same thing in politics, in economic, and socially in the real world. How can we not obviously are interconnecting these issues amongst each other? Because that's the thing that we keep forgetting about. And if we don't interconnect with these issues, whether it's social, economic, political, or culturally, it's basically, that's a recipe, not only autocratic, but also it's definitely going to deteriorate not only as a country, but also the people as a whole in the society itself. And I'll tell you, at the end of this message, I do wanted to have a last word of say to the people of France. Your courage, your spirit, and the will of your humanity has obviously given me a hope to continue to challenge against autocratic governments that I've been fighting for many years, because autocracy is not the basically has been happening currently right now. It's not the new form. It actually has been existed for many years. It just became invisible. It all started out with populist and nationalist rhetoric, and that ultimately becomes an autocratic form of governance. And even though autocratic governance has to get through military government style, or obviously has to be with the wealth of connection, but unfortunately it keeps changing to the point that we see as of today. And it doesn't have to be a political party. Excuse me. It doesn't have to be a political party. It can be obviously a candidate who obviously representing themselves, but also obviously willing to break against the old traditional norms, that they're not willing to progress what we actually been progressing for many years, especially with technological development. Whether it's willing to its tolerance for people who are obviously foreigners, or obviously someone who's intolerant, who are someone who is indifferent from each other. We actually have moved towards that. But unfortunately, I think the old traditional norms are coming back again, to the point that that is not the answer to this current society. And I'll tell you, I will bet you that those type of rhetoric that we see today are totally wrong. I could guarantee you that those people who say that democratic tradition is not the new norm, it shouldn't be the norm, but it should be an alternative method to say that autocratic government is the answer to our society. No, it does not. Because I will bet you yesterday's election will turn the tide against autocratic government, and the people of France have demonstrated it, that they're not up for autocratic governance, or they're not willing to obviously provide intolerance for those who are discriminate against people who are looking different from them in the workplace or in society, to the point that they're willing to tolerate for people who are obviously who look different from each other. This rhetoric is obviously not only just give emotionally, but also physically, to the point that it could potentially deteriorate not only a human, but also the humanity. The will of the people, obviously, our spirit is still exists after today, and that's what gives me hope and gives me courage. And I'm thinking that this is the real reason why I obviously give this I wouldn't say the video, just only a video itself, but it's obviously a world speech to let the world know that obviously humanity is still alive. It's still being optimistic. And that is one of the reasons for the past several years, even prior to the pandemic, that I knew that the democracy is in trouble. And I will tell you, obviously my obviously participation not only in the movements, and I actually started in South Korea with the Seoul Ferry tragedy. That obviously led me to obviously research the investigation, what exactly happened on that day. And it turned out it was all because of negligence. And Korea was under an autocratic government's influence that time. And I knew that something was going wrong, to the point that obviously it went to the wrong direction. And same thing what happened recently in South Korea presidential election. I think the people of South Korea actually turned into a wrong direction. They're going backwards. They're thinking that the oppositional candidate is obviously willing to give a social welfare, but unfortunately the country is about to run out of money. And potentially it could get into the fold if things are unchecked. And this is the thing that obviously I wanted to share, not only because the spirit of me obviously willing to uphold the moral values, but the rhetoric itself continues to not only deteriorate the will, the spirit of humanity, what we've been cherished for, but obviously I want to overcome the challenges, not only with the democracy, but fight against autocratic governments around the world. And for those, I wanted to speak for those people who are unwilling to voice because of oppression, because of the people who cannot speak up, because of potentially they will get into retaliation. And thankfully, because I'm from the U.S., that thinking that obviously I have the willing to fight for only for people who are obviously live here in the U.S., that's basically not the point. And I'm willing to fight for the people around the world, regardless of whichever location you're at. Because in the several months and years during the pandemic, obviously I talk with people who obviously have been under autocratic governments through use of many technologies and platforms. That would have not been possible in the previous generation, but unfortunately, it gave me a hope and courage when willing to fight and defend for democracy and for those who are obviously been entrapped because of autocracy. People have been suffering because of autocracy. Humanity have been deteriorated because of autocracy. And obviously, I will tell you that it is obviously becoming a more concerning and troubling that obviously if people are not willing to stand up against not only the wrongdoings, but for those who obviously think they're obviously the more values are wrong, but they have to obviously continue to fight against those, not only intolerance, but for those who obviously believe that the moral values are right, that they have to stand up for their values, which is I've been doing for many years. That I stand up for someone who obviously been oppressed. That I stand up for someone who obviously been mistreated. And I'm thinking that rhetoric has been spread around politics, which it should not. It should have not been entered the political arena. It should not. That discussion should have been obviously, it would have been stated internally, whether it's in the workplace or obviously being unbiased to the point that we should come together and obviously solve those differences. That should be left to the will of people and not politics. Politics is a total toxic and it's a dangerous form of ideals to the point that you could obviously bring your internal issues into the political arena to say that the politicians obviously have the desire to say that they're willing to change it for you. But unfortunately, they won't because they have other duties. And politics is not easy. I think we have been taken for granted for many years to the point that it makes me so angry and so sad to the point that I'm the only one who's obviously leading the front. Not only to trying to uphold the democracy, but to willing to fight for the will of the people to say that civil and obedience. Not only just because this is Asian culture, this is not a one-forward culture is coming from one country. It's not. It's all the part of the humanity that we've been cherished, but also have been taught from our parents ever since at the beginning of our childhood that we obviously have to be mutually respect and also be kind to each other. And we don't see that kind of a lot of hope in this day, in this pandemic era, where obviously people are willing to be divided because of intolerance, because of division amongst his own people, because of difference in opinion they're not willing to respect. That is what is so sickening to the point that makes me a lot of frustrated and angry to the point that they're not willing to be mutually respected and mutually wanted to have a conversation with each other. I have been doing that for many years. Ever since the school, they told us how to learn to be respectful for each other, but also how to be perseverance in a lot of those lifestyle challenges that we have to go through. And they obviously taught me how to do that in order to make sure that I've gone to the point where I become a leader as of today, not only as a country, but also as a young leader who obviously willing to inspire and millions of people around the world, either through social media platforms or any speeches that they're willing to invite for me out there. They're willing to encourage that humanity in the spirit and the courage of the will of the people is still alive. And I will tell you that obviously I think we need to not only just making sure that we have to be vigilant, not only to ourselves, but also the country itself, that we have to make a decisive and wise decision, but also have to make a careful decision on not only who we vote. And that means take the time to research the candidates, not just completely making rush decisions and users going to the poll votes or going to polling places where you just automatically assume that this candidate is best for you because of a simple, quick rhetoric note that basically are based on campaign messages saying, oh, obviously I'm going to vote for him because of uncertain issues that you might agree with. But ultimately, it would not turn out to be a good vote because of that simple rhetoric. Now, you may think it resonates with you personally, but unfortunately, it would not turn out to be a good result. But I think the France presidential election have demonstrated That only that the will of the spirit, the kind of humanity of the people that the French people actually have demonstrated throughout the world, but it actually have been shown through actions and words and hope that have been averted, that ultimately would have been becoming definitely a democratic crisis. Because if yesterday's election would have not averted and it would have been gone to a kind, moderate person who is obviously willing to stand up for his own people, but willing to, making sure that they're willing to fight for his own people, they're willing to listen to his own people. And I think Macron even said that in the victory speech last night. That's what resonated with me a lot. He's not only sharing his own ideals and his passion and his values for his own political parties. He's not willing to do that. He's willing to stand up for all sides of the people, regardless of your party affiliation. And I think in political parties is obviously damaging our society to the point that you have to choose one side or the other, or otherwise it will be completely a nightmare. And I don't believe obviously there should be a one-sided answer, or there's one right answer or one wrong answer. There is no right or wrong answer. They have been taught you in a school and education. And how can we not apply those in the real world settings? And that's what makes me, not only yesterday's election result, I would have been remarkable. And I know it was a narrow, slim margin vote that ultimately would have been gone too close to call vote, but they obviously ultimately have not carried out at least 50% of the vote in order to win the election, the first call. But ultimately, that gave an opportunity for Macron to give a people the second chance that he wanted to, not only to improve what he wanted to do in his second term, but also the willing to courage for those people who are on the opposite side of the aisle to give him a chance. And I'm thinking there's always going to be a second chance in life that obviously been given to you, which I have been giving a lot of second chance for other people that have been given to me, which I obviously been improved. And I showed it and demonstrated and exactly what happened in yesterday's election, where Macron gave him a second chance for the second term that the people of France have been given to him. Even from the other people of the aisles who are willing to give him a second chance, regardless of their ideals. It would have been becoming a total dangerous situation if Le Pen would have obviously won the election. And I knew obviously she would obviously run for another election, which definitely that gave them an edge to the point that they would ultimately be defeated by the Democrat ideals. Well, guess what? Yesterday's election has been a total different result. Obviously, they were wrong. Especially when Le Pen's ideas are totally outrageous to the point that it is so obnoxious to bring those horrific rhetorics that obviously we don't want to hear. But there's some people who want to go move backwards in society to the point that they want to feel nostalgic. And I understand that we cannot take away nostalgia. We cannot take away from that. We do feel nostalgic each and every time, someday once in a while. We do. I do feel nostalgic from the past and the events that have been cherished stuff. But that does not ultimately becomes a good result or a good positive result in the real world, because it did not. And I think that's why the French people decided that it's time to move on. It's time to uphold the democratic principles. It's time to give a second chance to Macron. And I think that's what had been demonstrating the will of the people of France. And I knew that obviously the French people will obviously make the right decision, which they did. Those people obviously have not been voting in the election. I do understand your concern, and I do understand the real reasoning, even for those people in the other side of the aisle. I'm not obviously doing this for endorsing for one candidate or another or supporting. I'm creating this video to show the will of the humanity still exists. But I'm not willing to fall in one side of the aisle, one side of the ideas, because obviously it's the right thing to do. No, it's not. Humanity obviously have been taught us to be obviously objective, rational, instead of irrational and not objective, and being biased to fall into the trap into the political party affiliation to the point that it has not been worked. And I'm thinking that till this day, I hope that obviously autocratic will prove that it was wrong. It is totally damaging our society. It is becoming destructive. And to the French people there who obviously voted for election, I applaud you for your outstanding contribution. Not only you protected the democracy, but you fight against an autocratic government that potentially would have been the opposition candidate would have been voted for and obviously campaigned for, but also willing to obviously vote in a policy for. And that would have been destructive. And the country of France would have been ultimately become an autocratic government if things would have not gone there. And I'm telling you, even though this speech is very long, but I'll tell you that I think this pandemic has been giving us a lot of opportunities and challenging us, our democratic ideals, that not only gives us a warning of some of the exposes of our weakness in society, but it's actually giving us an opportunity to repair, to reform, to rebuild what we have in an existing institution, the policies and the statutes of the ideals of the law, and turn them into a transformative, the opportunities and engaging to the point that it will obviously become a better form of governance, the institutional policies, the willingness of the spirit of the human people. It still exists. And that's what gives me hope. And that's what gives me courage. And that's why I'm standing up. Not only for moral values, but also willing to stand up for those who obviously are being oppressed or taking away their rights because who they are, or those who believe the freedom of press should be obviously been upheld, even regardless if it's not within their own ideas. Willing to listen to other people of the aisle will not only restore democratic principles, but also the democratic ideas and the governance. That's how the democracy works and functions. Not just obviously someone who obviously storm into the building, obviously what we saw last year in the United States in the January 6th, and potentially became a destructive. And in this case, they broke the rule of law. And I don't want that to happen to any other parts of the world to experience the same thing. And I'm thinking that it will bring an opportunity to not only to repair, but also provide a sense of urgency to a lot of people around the world. And I'm thinking that will potentially give a wake-up call to a lot of citizens around the world to say that we had enough of autocratic governance. We had enough of intolerance. We had enough of people who have obviously been mistreated because they're foreigners, or obviously who look indifferent because they're not part of their national identity. This nationalism, this autocratic governance, it's not working. It's already been failed. Especially with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, that Ukraine has been persevered even still to this day, that they're willing to fight for democracy and they're willing to ask for help, which I did. Became that part of that contribution, and I'm willing to obviously continue to fight for the freedom of Ukraine, but also the prosperity for the people of Ukraine as well, to live better for the next generation, but also willing to fight for it, the democracy ideals, to prevent from the same tragedies that is about to carry forward for the future generation. I do not want my future child or the grandchildren or the future generation to suffer because of the inaction that we don't take care of. And that's why I continue to fight for all this time, and I'm continuing to fight for anyone who obviously has been accused, or obviously who've been feared, or obviously who look indifferent because of their mistreated. I'm willing to fight for the people around the world. Not just because of this is other people, I would say this is a political rhetoric. No, it's not. This is this is a real person that is willing to give a contribution around the world to say that democracy is still the true answers to our society as of today. I hope obviously you took a great moment A great time, obviously, for me, obviously, to give a speech to the point that it gives me urgency to say that that's why I'm willing to, obviously, not only fight for democracy, but also willing to fight for the will of the people and trying to uphold the democracy and the humanity, but also the moral values. That's what's important, and that's what could get us get out of this trap of autocracy and move into a much more better form of democratic governance. And what we need is to have more creativity and more innovation in the long term. And that is why we need to have more intellectuals, more ideas, and obviously share those ideas and debate them. Have discussions, even those who obviously who has different ideas than you, and willing to collaborate and come together to solve today's challenges and today's problems. And I will tell you one thing, the last word, that I am optimistic. What are the things that are about to challenge us or about to test us? Because today's examples are pretty much like if you were taking a test, taking an exam, basically how far in advance you've been made, or how much progress you made, or how much knowledge you've been carried through. And I think that's exactly what I've been tested for. Not only as a country, but also throughout the world, that I'm willing to fight against those challenges. And I have the tolerance. I have the ability to obviously cooperate regardless of where you're from. And that is why I given this speech today, because what we saw in yesterday's election was obviously a totally good example of how the people are willing to come together and provide unity to obviously vote for a presidential candidate in France to avert an autocracy and avert the democratic crisis in France and the rest of Europe. Because if that would have been obviously became an alternative method and they voted for someone who is obviously have a populist rhetoric and autocratic governance, that could be a big hurdle to America's, not only the challenges of democracy, but also a biggest hurdle to the point that it will ultimately become an autocracy. And we don't want that anywhere to happen around the world, ever. So obviously that concludes my speech, and as well as my thoughts and my conclusion, what's going on in the world. And I hope obviously you enjoyed the speech of mine, how I obviously perceive throughout the rest of the world the trendings and the courage to obviously care enough for everyone around the world, regardless of location or regardless of their gender, their identity, or their person. And I'm thinking I've taken a great time to obviously to give a speech like this in a very long time. Thank you very much. And this is James Paek from the United States. Thank you very much for listening.